A lot of the time, when we talk about the English language, there are hard and fast rules that apply in most scenarios, like the fact that the language is written from left to right, for instance. But there are also certain rules, beliefs, and even potentially myths that persist in our collective consciousness. These myths are more flexible, or even completely untrue. This video, and the series that it's a part of, will help educate you on some of the more common falsehoods, or points of confusion, that you'll often hear talked about in your English class. Welcome to our video series titled Top 5 Myths You Hear in English Classrooms. Linguistic Justice and Black Language. This video does something a little different than the others in this series thus far. While discussing the myth of white English hegemony, or mainstream white English, it also outlines the cultural and linguistic importance of Black language, as outlined by April Baker Bell in her newest book, Linguistic Justice, Black Language, Literacy, Identity, and Pedagogy. And while I can't take the time to fully unravel every word that Baker Bell shares in her book, I plan on covering a few of her points that are more directly applicable to our context as a composition textbook. First, Baker Bell focuses on defining some terms that are worth unpacking here. You can see them on the screen next to me. These terms are white mainstream English, Black language, and anti-Black linguistic racism. Let's take some time to talk about each of those words now. Baker Bell defines white mainstream English as similar to standard English, but specifically, Baker Bell uses white mainstream English in place of standard English to define how white ways of speaking become invisible, or better, inaudible, as the norm. Baker Bell is reminding us that through many of the same historical choices made across the field of English and composition, the idea of standard English has become equated with a certain level of whiteness. We've talked about this in a few videos so far. But by explicitly using white mainstream instead of standard, Baker Bell calls on us to recognize that a lot of what we think as good or standardized English is really just white ways of speaking. Black language, sometimes referred to as Black English, Ebonics, African American Vernacular English, African American language, etc., is the term that Baker Bell uses throughout her text to describe the way of speaking and creating meaning of the African American community, and specifically the language that comes out of the experience of U.S. slave descendants. The roots of this language and way of speaking acted as a form of resistance and created a communication style that would be unintelligible and purposefully different to dominant English speakers of the day. Finally, Baker Bell discusses the concept of anti-Black linguistic racism. Baker Bell defines this as the linguistic violence, persecution, dehumanization, and marginalization that Black language speakers experience in schools and everyday life. For Baker Bell and other scholars, anti-Black linguistic racism is at the core of many academic and cultural judgments made about the Black community. When talking about Black ways of creating meaning or speaking, frequently those conversations will turn back to the legibility, the intelligence, or even the humanity of the person speaking using Black language. What is important about understanding these terms for our purposes is how we understand both the small, hidden ways that we critique and belittle Black language in the classroom, while also appropriating and absorbing this language into our white, mainstream forms of English. In the classroom, you may have heard discussions around the concept of a home language or mother language when discussing writing. You may have heard that the language you speak at home is valid and acceptable, but not in certain contexts or circumstances. In the specific example of Black language, this idea holds true in the majority of our writing history. The widespread acceptance of phrases rooted in Black language and Black literacies, like the ones you see on the screen next to me, hasn't penetrated through to the classroom environment because these phrases are seen as slang, and therefore lesser than a white mainstream version of English. Yet, according to Baker Bell, these bits of black language have become commoditized and capitalized on by non-black language speakers for marketing or for play, but it becomes unacceptable once a native black language speaker attempts to use that language as a linguistic resource at school. Think of the amount of times you have seen the phrases I showed above in apps like TikTok, on Twitter, in advertisements trying to sell you things. But not as much in the classroom. Admittedly, this duality is confusing, because both myself and Baker Bell seem to be saying that black language is both loved and hated by spaces that value white mainstream or standard English. That's because we are both saying that. When it comes to understanding black language, this love-hate relationship is something that has to be looked at closely, especially when we exist in mainly white spaces. Something for you to consider as you move forward through your composing is the stock you put into the idea of what makes good, acceptable English language and what makes slang or internet language or unacceptable English, regardless of your race, cultural, or linguistic background. Ask yourself, who tends to use the type of language that you find unacceptable, or the type of language that you've been taught is unacceptable? Ask yourself where you see black language and the language of other people of color groups being used and accepted, and consider why that might be. English 103 and English 104 focus heavily on the idea of understanding and analyzing the rhetorical context in which you're composing. How you speak to or write to a particular audience might change based on the context you're in. The question I will leave you with as I wrap up this video is a straightforward one that has a very complex system of answers. Why has the university been labeled as a context where black language and the language of other marginalized groups is not an acceptable, an intelligent, or a meaningful way of communicating? Thanks for watching.